First of all, thanks for speaking to me again. I really appreciate it. And you've been doing RPG research since basically before it was cool, right? I mean, this book is 2013.
That book is actually 2010, and it was written in 2007 for my
Definitely.
dissertation. Yeah.
Okay. Definitely like pre Stranger Things and stuff like that.
So
So
yes, I am old, if that's what you're intrigued in.
so am I. But I've got my 50th coming up next year, which is a bit terrifying. But anyway, so a couple of things I wanted to talk to you about today, and you've been thinking about this for like an incredibly long time. And also a kind of an issue I have with one of the concepts as well. So the main concept is bleed. But
Mhm.
as you mentioned before, it's worth talking about probably a couple of things as well. Character, of course, but also the magic circle, because the magic circle and bleed are obviously quite tied in with each other. But also that's where I feel there's a bit of a tension. So I suppose first of all, it's probably worth you saying something about who you are and why you got into this subject of bleed in the first place.
Sure. So my name is Sarah Lynne Bowman. I'm currently an associate professor at Uppsala University on campus Scotland in Sweden. And before that, I was a community college teacher, and I still am actually in Texas. And I basically spent a lot of time running around and meeting people. After my book came out, I received a lot of invitations to go to different communities because my book was quite limited in terms of scope. I really was only talking about D&D and vampire because that was my experience base. Um, and so since then, I've been very involved in the Nordic LARP scene and other communities. And so yeah, sorry, I'm going to get notifications that are going to distract me through this whole
Right.
thing. But it looks like I'm losing my concentration. Um, and the reason I started studying bleed is because I had a pretty significant mental breakdown is not the best word for it, but I definitely had like a mental rupture as a result of playing vampire. Not that the game caused that, but what I felt to be I had higher needs for community support than I had at the time. Let's just put it that way. In part because nobody had language for any of this or really understood what was going on. So we were playing very intensely all the time with our shadow and like aspects of consciousness that are usually kept, very down tight for a reason. And we didn't really have any tools to debrief or process any of that. So I started interviewing people and trying to understand what was going on with that. But I think in general, I also have been very interested in, I called it blurring in my book because we didn't have that word yet. Uh, in terms of personal transformation, in terms of the kinds of things that you can take out of a game that can help improve your life. So, bleed is not the only important concept in terms of transformational role playing games. Transfer is also very important, and transfer can happen whether you are experiencing bleed or not, or whether you're consciously experiencing it or not. But I do think it is an important factor because it is when people are noticing it, i.e., it reaches above this bleed threshold, perception threshold that Shal Hedgard Hugels has theorized, then that can be that can lead to aha moments for some people, or very emotionally destabilizing moments or psychologically destabilizing moments that can either be disruptive to life and or can lead to insights.
Can I
So
ask,
the yeah.
so just in terms of how would we define blurring slash bleed in the context in which you're speaking, just for anyone who hasn't read up on that stuff before? You're the best place to do this. How would you describe
It's super complex,
it?
of course. There are several bleed theories, and probably more will arrive. But essentially, when we play ourselves in daily life, we experience that, depending on who you're talking to, as somewhat of a unified, singular experience. Of course, some people have more fragmented personalities, experience shifting in daily life, but when we start a game, we experience ourselves as an entity that has a specific consciousness. And then when we play a role playing game, we're holding that consciousness, but we're also holding theory of mind of another character. And so it's this sort of dual consciousness state. And so when you're in that state, you can have varying degrees of immersion into the character. Sometimes you can be very detached, and the character is more like you're a puppeteer. Moira Turkington came up with this particular language. Sometimes you wear it like a mask or it's like a puppet. And sometimes it's what she calls possessing force, which I don't want to compare it to possession in spiritual traditions, but it's that experience of the character, quote unquote, taking over, which I don't think in role playing games happens for very long phenomenologically. I think that's more like a moment of really high immersion. And then we step back into some degree of dual consciousness from that experience of going into the game frame, playing this character, co-creating a reality with other people, when we come back out of it, either going in or coming out, we can notice psychological contents that come from the outside world into the game, from our own psyches into the game and out of the game. Of course, that's likely happening the entire time, but it's again this noticeable quality of it. And so, for example, it might do with just emotions. That's the really common definition of it. But there's lots of other ways to think about it, like relationship dynamics. Like, let's say you and I develop a friendship as colleagues, and then, oh, well, we're playing a LARP together, and all of a sudden we're friends, because we already have an attunement, familiarity. So it makes sense that that would bleed over. And some people have to consciously avoid people, in games in order for that not to kind of influence. Other people lean into it, and that's fine. Um, Obviously, that can also affect things like romance. Playing a very intense romance can then sometimes lead to feelings off game. Uh, it can affect personality and identity. So it can affect uh, bringing in or out archetypal contents, for example, or personality traits that then sort of become part of the person's definition of self afterwards. Um, and all of these terms have people associated with them. So that term in particular, Whitney Beltran came up with ego bleed. Um, Michelle Hedgard Hugos, as I mentioned before, has talked about emotional procedural. So, things that bleed in from our bodies and are the way that we hold our bodies, and also mimetic bleed. So, psychological ideologies, constructs. So, a very famous one is called the LARP democracy, when even if you're playing a very oppressive scenario where there's no reason why the group should mobilize to be democratic, all of a sudden they're democratic, right? Because they've bled in those values and those ways of being that are then influencing the game. And then one of the key topics is emancipatory bleed, especially in terms of people who are experiencing marginalization. And Janaea Kemper is the one that's theorized this. And through play, people can experience either challenging these norms within themselves or challenging systems, or just experiencing freedom from that marginalization. And that can be emancipatory in their daily life if that feeling can be captured and then ideally made concrete in other aspects of life. Of course, there are limits to that because marginalization is an outside force. It's not something that's purely internal. And that's true for transformation in general. There's certain things that are easier to solidify, to transfer, to integrate than others based on your context.
So, if, for example, I had them, and I'm remembering now a scene from a TV show I used to like called the IT Crowd, where a game of D&D was actually played in it, and it was used in a comedic way, to help someone whose ex had left him without any word. Role play a situation that was quite similar, but with an opportunity for them to say goodbye to each other. And it stuck in my head, first of all, because it was one of the first instances I'd ever seen of a TTRPG being in a popular TV show. This was 10, 15 years ago, if not more. So does this link in with the concept in the sense that, for example, you could, in theory, use TTRPGs, consciously or otherwise, to kind of self-therapize or to be therapeutic for someone else at the table? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yes. And that's one of the things we study. I'm in a research group called the Transformative Play Initiative, and we have a textbook out, which I'll send you the link for, called Transformative Role Playing Game Design. We have a lot of sections on therapeutic role playing, not just the original therapeutic role playing that's been involved in therapy for a long time, but also how to use these games specifically in a therapeutic context. And Electra Diacolambrianou has been the therapist that's been working with me on that, counselor. So that episode is one of the best representations, I think, actually, especially at the time. I was really impressed by the depth of what they were sharing. And I was like, oh, they're talking about bleed. So, yes, absolutely. I mean, the idea, it wouldn't be very helpful for him if he wasn't having a bunch of strong feelings that came bled in from outside, right? That he could then work with. But it also, if you think about it from a narrative therapy perspective or a narrative identity perspective, which are kind of related, meaning we construct stories about our life, and sometimes we have life stories that keep us stuck, like, oh, she left me and I can't get over it. And I don't have any value anymore, for example. And then being able to process that with a group of caring people that are doing that purposefully can absolutely have a therapeutic effect. And using narrative to do it can help you re-narrativize your own life. So that's actually an awesome example of what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I wish I could play that for people, but presumably I can't because there's all sorts of copyright around it. But yeah, maybe I'll put a link to it somewhere. Um, so being devil's advocate here as well around this concept of bleed. So there were all these panics in the early 80s in particular about the impact of D&D on players. And the common defense was it's just a game. These people know how to quarantine their game experience from their real life. But this concept of bleed and using it positively, it has a tension with that counter explanation, doesn't it? It suggests, well, actually, when it suits us, the researchers, then yeah, it can affect you and in good ways. But when it suits people like bothered about Dungeons and Dragons and whatnot, it does not. And it's a difficult question, but how do we resolve that tension in your view, or have I misunderstood the tension?
No, that's absolutely one of the reasons that it's taken so long for this theory to emerge, I think, because it was taboo to talk about these things in a lot of these communities for that very reason. Nobody wants to be labeled with, you've lost touch with reality, or you've don't remember who you are because you've become the character. And they certainly don't want to be labeled with the content of the game. So if I say a game can affect your paradigm, and you're playing some sort of like, occult game, that's one of the fears, right? Oh, these people are all going to join the occult, which I'm not going to say that doesn't happen, but it's not a very common effect of the game. It's more likely that people are working with content that's already part of their psyche through metaphor of, for example, in World of Darkness, through metaphor of being the monster. And it's
Right.
not that they're actually a monster and they're going to go and do these things that the character does. It's that the metaphor and the psychological elements of World of Darkness games in general, which, by the way, were based on the ideas of Carl Jung and other psychologists, um, they are there to help have a more powerful play experience. They're not always used that way. We can talk about vampire in reality versus vampire in terms of its intention, but um, that is one thing. So it's kind of like with violent video games, right? The assumption is that, oh, these kids are playing these violent video games and that means they're going to be violent. Well, that's just not, that doesn't track with the actual data. It's a fear. So you can't say that there's a one-to-one representation between what happens in the game and what the person ends up developing into. As a matter of fact, more often than not, when playing with shadow work, people come out of the game very reaffirmed in their moral stance. So the transformation that happened can actually go the other way, right? It's like, I never want to be like my character, or I will take from my character how strong they were, how they stood up for themselves, but I'm definitely leaving behind these other characteristics. So there's a cognitive process around integration that takes place. Bleed is just a sort of unconscious experience, and then you do something with that content after you leave the game. So, and then there are people that can quarantine very well. I mean, I've gotten messages from people who have acting background and they're like, we were taught never to do this, that's the really bad way to do acting. I think method acting is very poorly understood by a lot of method actors, honestly, the original intention behind it. But there are people that will, consciously put aside their own personality and adopt the character for years on end, sometimes when they're filming. And that's, of course, that could be interpreted as a psychological break if you think it depends on your interpretation, but it's definitely a break from the social constructs that were there before, the relationships and all of that kind of stuff. So to answer your question more directly, that dual consciousness state is not becoming the character. Like I said, I think that only happens for brief moments of times, but it is very powerful. And the space in between the self and the character is where a lot of this insight and processing can happen. When you have a community context that does not allow space for that kind of processing, it can have negative impacts. That doesn't mean that the game is negatively impacting you. It's that you've pulled up content that has nowhere to be processed. And that's challenging in any context, regardless of whether it's a game or not. And I wanted to go back to what you asked about self-therapizing and all of that. Um, it's not therapy unless you have a trained professional mental health or paraprofessional mental health person there with some sort of client relationship to guide you through that. You can also work with the group with the content if they agree to do that. Problem with most leisure games is there's not an agreement ahead of time that we're going to be processing our own personal stuff after this game, which I think there should be, but that's
Mm.
just me.
No, that's interesting. I've never experienced a game where people have introduced it as something where we want to try and change ourselves, any aspect of ourselves as actual human beings by the end of the campaign or the one shot, whatever it might be. But that would be an interesting, well, I mean, I'd certainly like to observe one of those and see what happens. You reminded me of something when you talked about the occult. I spoke with a guy called Mark Barrowcliff who authored a book called The Elfish Gene, which was about essentially about a young man's D&D addiction. Um, and I mean, he's basically a comedian as well. And he said something along the lines of, I'm paraphrasing him, that D&D didn't get him into the occult. He was already into it. And I think it dovetails with what you've said. It sounds to me like people bring whatever they bring with them to the table. The game doesn't find them as empty jars and pour things into their brains. It's about how whatever's already inside people manifests in whatever way it does. So we should therefore expect that there will be quite wide individual differences in the people who are susceptible. Susceptible is maybe the wrong word, but sensitive
Yeah.
to crossing that membrane and having these experiences where the kind of magic circle I don't know if it breaks down, but the quarantine breaks down to some extent. And there'll be some people who are expert at maintaining that wall, or really don't want to pass that wall and therefore are expert at it. And I wonder if this might explain for some reason why, for example, why some people seem to be never gamers as well. So some people, I would never do something like D&D. I would never do a tabletop role-playing game. And I wonder if in part that might be, of course, they're allowed not to want to do it. I don't particularly like cauliflower. There's nothing wrong with not liking cauliflower. But maybe there's a fear that playing a role might actually bring out things in a person that they don't want to bring out in public in a minority of that group of never gamers, for example. I wonder if you had any experience or knowledge of individual differences that you've experienced in role-playing games in these contexts.
Wow. I mean, that's basically what I study. So it's very, as a qualitative researcher, we're asking people about their experience and, the idea that we can in any way generalize is it's very much what we call a subjective diegesis, meaning, and this is Marcus Montela's term, we have our own subjective perception of the game and they are all different. And even within our own minds, they're all different depending on, like you said, one's ability to, I don't believe that quarantine actually exists. I think stuff is always flowing over, like Shell also believes, but noticeably, right? If you can't basically push it away and say that never happened, then you're consciously experiencing this bleed effect. And we have this concept called alibi that has a very interesting relationship to bleed. It's very difficult to always explain the relationship between the two, but essentially, alibi is being given enough permission, whether it's by the setting being World of Darkness or the GM being super supportive of whatever character choices you make in that moment, or the group, whatever. Maybe the group offers you some fiction that gives you permission to then explore something you would have really not felt comfortable exploring in a group before. All of this has to be strong enough in the person's mind for them to even play to begin with. And a lot of people don't have, probably, there's a couple things going on here. They either don't feel like they have sufficient alibi, they haven't been given enough of a encouragement or a feeling of safety to be able to drop their vigilance and actually go into something like this. I also think that there are some people that are either more suited or more fantasy prone, as we talked about before. It's easier for them to imagine themselves as another character. If they watch a movie, they feel much more strongly attached. This is this absorption concept, or they feel the feelings of their character, what they perceive to be. And so for people who have a high fantasy proneness, high absorption, we don't have fully all the numbers for this. There's some preliminary studies coming out, and we're conducting some as well. But I suspect they might have a much larger chance of being interested in even trying something like this, and certainly long-term play. And similarly, perspective taking, being able to take the perspective of others, empathy. These are all things that maybe prime people. And you and I've talked a little bit about openness to experience as a personality dimension. And I think that is one of the key things, actually, because if someone has a low openness to experience, well, then of course they're likely a never gamer, right? They're not willing to go outside what's familiar. And that's fine. Like, no, people don't have to role play, like, but for those of us who want to, or for those of us who want to bring it as an intervention, for the folks that might be actually really open to this, it can be life-changing.
One of the things that came up in a recent survey I did speaks very much to what you just said, which is the kind individual differences. So one of the things I found was we surveyed about 300 odd very, very experienced TTRPG players, and we found a correlation between something called personal distress, which is the sense of anxiety that is provoked by seeing other people or being in an intense situation, social situation. A link between that and the kind of player, the kind of character that players like to play, meaning that the more prone people are to personal distress in intense situations, the less likely they were to play a character that was quite similar to their own personality. So it strikes me that people who have this kind of this intense anxiety around, well, this anxiety around tense social situations, let me get my words the right way around, don't want to play a character similar to themselves in case they feel a bit too similar. They feel a bit too involved, a bit too immersed in the situation, and it bleeds over into their own experience, and they start to feel anxious because it's like something is happening to them.
Mhm.
And that struck me as really interesting also because there's enough of a variation in these people in the survey that that kind of result can come out. So some people are very anxious in such situations. Some people are not. They all play the game, but they play it very differently. They choose different kinds of characters as a result. And I wonder if that's a way that some people, say people have high absorption, which is we could briefly describe it or define it as a susceptibility to suggestions, even hypnosis and things like that. Some people who maybe feel that that's quite powerful in themselves, that they're quite susceptible to suggestion, decide to play someone of a very different quality to them so that that danger doesn't arise so much during the game. Does that tally with your experience in your research as well?
Yes and no. Um, I think it depends on the context. I mean, if you're talking about leisure D&D gamers that are in a context where maybe it doesn't feel super safe to play someone super close to home, then that totally makes sense. Although I will say that first-time gamers often play characters similar to themselves, so they may not even be realizing there's a risk there that they might feel something powerfully, for example. Um, but it makes total sense what you're describing in that they need more alibi. It's basically what we're saying here. It's like, I don't feel like I can really, because it might not just be that they don't want to have the sensations. It may be that they may not feel like they can actually play at all if the character is too similar to themselves. And I do know folks like this who enjoy deeply cathartic play, who are really into personal transformation, but just the way their brain works, if they don't have enough alibi, they just become themselves, which is fine, but it's not the experience that they're looking for. So there's also, I think, different needs in terms of how much fiction is there to support the process and the alibi. I will say, though, that, like, for example, in the Nordic LARP tradition and associated communities or adjacent communities, there's a strong emphasis on having these deeply emotional, cathartic experiences and having very cognitively and emotionally and behaviorally even difficult experiences. So in that case, it's much more normative. So I would be super interested to, and we can do this because we did a study. We have Joshua Javrud, Hugos, and I have put out a study, and we have asked people specifically what kind of games they play, and we can start teasing out these factors. So it'd be really interesting to look at our two data sets together. And yes, sorry, people, we are going to get nerdy in this episode, but that's just going to happen. So
Yeah, yeah, that's probably true. One quick question, because I've not done any direct research or intense reading in any way into LARP, but I know it's something that you're very interested in. This bleed idea that we've been centering on, I presume that's quite different in LARP scenarios relative to TTRPGs. Would you say that?
Again, it's very context dependent. I've played incredibly intense tabletop sessions that were, life-changing and immersive and all of that. I think the more mechanics that you have, the more abstraction you have. It doesn't mean it's not emotional and intense. Like if everybody's trying to kill the dragon and, they're really afraid of dying, that can be a very powerful, intense experience. And some people have huge shifts in the way they perceive friendship in those situations, for example, like other people having their back, like that being really powerful. So we really can't uh, generalize. Unfortunately, I would love to. To be completely frank with you, because D&D is so popular right now and so easy to access, the vast majority of the transformative literature coming out is about leisure D&D right now. So people are obviously having deeply important experiences, even within the context of a game that might otherwise be considered quite silly and, have all of these elements that might distract from, a more, let's say, therapeutic kind of engagement. But that is also quite interesting because it means it's sort of sneaking up on people, right? Like it's like surprise therapeutic impact, incidental or accidental impact that they reflect upon later as being hugely important. What I will say about LARP is that also LARP, of course, depends. I mean, a lot of the educational LARPs I'm designing right now are about sitting around a table, so you could just as easily be playing a TTRPG. But in general, LARP tends to be more embodied. It doesn't always include a lot of movement or costuming. It can, or even being in a different physical location. I mean, we've LARPed in our living room, for many, many years. Uh, but something about the somatic experience of physically enacting things can be incredibly powerful. But there's also people that have super boring experiences at LARP. So we can't assume that a LARP is always going to be more powerful than a tabletop experience. And for people who are very self-conscious about their physicality for any reason, whether it could be many reasons, maybe they feel judgment from others, for example, then it could actually be easier to play tabletop because they don't feel like that's so visible or so much a part of the way that they're showing up. On the other hand, if they are very self-conscious and they're used to experiencing judgment because of their physicality, and they go to a LARP where everybody's super loving and they're getting all these hugs and they're having these really powerful physical experiences, like, for example, in combat or even sexuality or any number of other things, that can be transformative. So it does really depend on the person, the game. I mean, even calling something D&D, I realized very early on in my research, we can't assume at all what that even means. I walked into a room where people were playing D&D where no one was in character the entire time.
Mm.
And when I tried to play the character, they were confused and I think a little felt it was disruptive. Nothing against that group. That's just how they play. But it's very different than when, for example, my former partner, Hattie Green, would run it, and we would have these very deep, powerful, sometimes spiritual experiences. We hardly ever use the dice. Those are both technically D&D, but they're very different experiences of D&D.
Yeah. Is it fair to say, therefore, that there isn't really another game or leisure activity, use my British pronunciation here, a leisure activity, that has this capacity for those people who interact with it in a certain way to have it impact their lives and possibly change them, uh,
I,
that currently exists? Is that fair to say? Not certainly not, would we say not computer RPGs, for example?
Hmm. This is really complex because, again, what provokes transformation in a person can be very different. I mean, what we consider transformative might be very different. I've heard of people, their lives changing from one improv exercise, which we would consider a warm up or not even fully in, sometimes we're annoyed because we want to get to the real role playing, like, so it kind of really depends. And also, um, I don't think people like to talk a lot about mechanics and design as being key. And don't get me wrong, I'm a game design professor, like, or associate professor. You know, it 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 is very important design. It does affect the game. But honestly, just playing a role is one of the most powerful things you can experience, whether it's in an improv experience, moment, or if it's in World of Darkness or Fiasco or whatever. Even if it doesn't really even matter what the tone is per se, it can affect the person. However, certain kinds of designs are more suited for, I think, for that kind of work, and certain kinds of social conditions, social support networks, safety tools, etc. I think people feel more comfortable going into those kinds of moments when there is a vocabulary for safety around the table, and when there is a norm around talking about safety. Because that, even if you never have a safety discussion after, let's say, a session zero where you've discussed boundaries, that didn't exist when I was playing D&D, okay? But there was no awareness when I was growing up about this kind of stuff. Um, that already sets a tone that says, we here at the table care about each other and we're going to take care of each other, and that's more important than the game.
So
Now
just,
yeah, go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead.
I
Oh,
was just going to say that you have to reinforce that throughout the game. If then you just ignore the safety rules and somebody's clearly having emotional distress, that can actually be even more damaging. But yes, go ahead.
just with my devil's advocate hat on again, always trying to be balanced in some respect. If a game benefits from boundaries being set at the start of it, doesn't that suggest that it can provoke powerful experiences and should be treated a bit differently relative to other games? And for some people, for some players, it can, for want of a better word, be harmful or emotionally unpleasant in some ways. Maybe based on the interaction or the other people that they're actually gaming with. Because we wouldn't need boundary setting for Monopoly, or something similar like that. Oh, you
Are you
disagree?
sure? I've heard a lot of table flipping stories about Monopoly, but
Wow.
yes, it's a different experience for sure. It's working with personal material, for example. That will always be riskier. I prefer the term risk here rather than danger. Some people, especially like things like Nordic LARP, we talk about it as emotional extreme sports. Like you are putting yourself in situations where, a lot of stuff is likely to come up, or you are making yourself deliberately vulnerable, and then someone else is abusing you, for example. Like that is a pretty specific kind of experience that requires um, a certain amount of bravery, I would say, a certain amount of willingness, but also community care from my perspective. But even playing Vampire the Masquerade, which is probably the second most popular game. At least it was when I, started role playing in the 90s. We have Vampire LARP. That's a very, very common thing all around the world. And that game does work with a lot of this very personal content and did not until very recently integrate safety tools or really, in fact, the common norm in these communities was IC does not equal OOC, meaning anything that happens in character is not real. So you shouldn't be having any kind of emotional reaction to it, which is to me a very problematic way of viewing these games because we bring our psyches. Of course, we're going to have reactions to the game, and that's part of why we play. If we didn't have like this whole idea of quarantine, people aren't acknowledging all the really powerful experiences that they are having at the table, right? Like they wouldn't be there if it was boring or if they had no sort of rush, maybe when they're rolling initiative, for example. I think that it's a bit of a more of a mental defense mechanism than an actual thing. But to answer your question, the game itself does not have an effect. And we talked about this in terms of, you mentioned earlier something very similar, but in media studies, we call that the hypodermic needle effect, like this idea that media just gets shot into you and it changes you, and that's been very much, backed away from in media studies for a very long time. It's more that the game creates conditions by which you are vulnerable. Just like you mentioned hypnosis, that is another state. There's lots of different states that we can get into. And that's one of the reasons in our studies we're also looking at different subcultural affiliations. Like, are these folks interested in BDSM? Do they go to Burning Man? Are they involved in an improv group? Or, what kinds of other groups do they involve themselves in? And do those groups also involve vulnerable states or shifts in consciousness? Because that's super interesting to me. Because that would suggest that this person is drawn to those experiences in general, and role playing just happens to be one of them, right? So I think I want to acknowledge that harm is very possible and does happen. It's a lot less common than we think, than the moral panics would think. Let's just put it that way. But when it does happen, we need to be able to mindfully and with care address it in the group. And sometimes that itself can be transformational. Maybe you have a trauma trigger that comes up and you felt very alone in that trauma memory, but then all of a sudden here you are with this group, like with, the IT, example, where all of a sudden you feel supported, and that it's in and of itself is transformational. So I don't think necessarily having a strong, quote unquote, negative emotional response is a bad thing. I think that it's what we do with it as a group that matters.
This has been really interesting. Thank you for this. And I wondered if kind of as an outro, you might be a good person to ask for this. Well, I'm sure you are. If you were speaking to someone who is RPG curious but has not yet played, how would you recommend, and maybe they've watched this because they're trying to work out if they want to do something like that. How would you recommend that they go about their first game?
I'm probably the worst person to ask because I'm not involved in any of these online servers or any of that. I think honestly, the best approach, if we're talking about tabletop, let's start there because LARP is different. Um, I would, first of all, look for communities online. I would look for communities that have similar affinity groups to what you already have. So, for example, if you feel an affinity group based on some sort of demographic aspect of your social identity, it's probably best to find people who are adjacent to that or have that same identity, simply because that doesn't mean you can't role play with people who are different. That's also really cool. But some people can feel a lot more comfortable when they are role playing with people like them. Let's just put it that way. There's already some trust that's been built because there's an assumption of shared experience. So what I see that can be quite harmful or experienced as harm is when people, for example, from marginalized identities, racial identities, ethnicity, et cetera, go into a group that is, that doesn't have those kinds of marginalizations, and microaggressions occur. And they're not even intentional. They're just, people don't even realize that they're being harmful. Like that, that can actually make it very difficult for the person to want to continue to play. And Mo Holkar has referred to this as the fun tax. Like you have to deal with that kind of stuff if you're a person of color engaging in a game, or from some other marginalized identity. It's the tax you pay to be part of the community. So I am not saying that we should segregate ourselves. I don't think that's particularly helpful, but in terms of trust, sometimes it can be quite helpful to have people who have similar life experiences or similar interests at the very least. Because, like I said, every D&D means something vastly different. For example, for people who play OSR, and they're really into hardcore games where you could die at any moment, and no safety tools or very minimal. That's a very different type of D&D than fifth edition is. So, you know, there are also ways you can sign up online. Again, that's sort of like playing Russian roulette. You don't know who you're going to get. You don't know what kind of experience you're going to have. I suspect that there are places where you can, groups out there that you can go on to, maybe Facebook groups or forums that have a specific bent that might feel safer. I would This isn't always the case, but I would assume that indie tabletop games would probably be more safety aware, for example, or at least there's more norms built around those games in terms of safety. It's still catching on in a lot of the more wide scale tabletop and LARP groups. The traditional is what I call them. Um, in LARP, there are several international LARPs that are part of a community that we overall talk about these sort of things and care about these sort of things. Now, your experience will vary from LARP to LARP depending on the organizing team, but we call it very vaguely the international LARP community. That's not very accessible for a lot of people if they don't have the finances, or they, for whatever reason, can't get a visa. That's a problem these days, right? So, like, to say, oh, you need to fly to Poland and that's how you're going to have a good LARP experience. No, it's more like, hey, we have a lot of free resources. I co-edit nordiclarp.org, for example, which has a lot of free resources. You can actually transform your own local group using these tools as well. So in the old days, you would go to the gaming store and that's how you would meet people. I don't know how much that's a thing anymore. I feel like there is some people that are really wanting that more physical, face-to-face engagement, and sometimes they'll have tournaments there. But I don't know how true this is now, but in the past, sometimes people would experiencing the gaming store as having folks that maybe aren't very careful about social cues, let's say, people who, yeah, so I don't really like talking about that because, of course, people have different neurodiversities and that affects how we interact with each other, and there's nothing wrong with that. But conventions and public spaces, it's harder to curate your group, let's just put it that way, to people that you feel comfortable around. So yeah, but I will say what's different from back then and now is that there's just tons of online community building happening. And so I don't think that it's impossible. I just think it's learning where to go. Maybe there's a specific Reddit group that talks about safety in role-playing games or something. That might be a good start.
Yeah, I'm a safety role. I think it's about the best people, the nicest people I can find. I
Hmm.
think my favorite games are just with people I like anyway. But most of the time when you're starting out, you have no idea who the other people at the table are. That's almost part and parcel of the start, unless you've got lots of interested friends who suddenly think, oh, why don't we try this game out? But then they might change a bit in their personality while they're playing because of things like bleed.
Hmm.
But yeah, I'm a bit of a wimp in that respect. I generally play with people familiar to me rather than others. But anyway, on that more pessimistic note, thank you so much for your time, sir. It's been really, really interesting talking to you, and I think I've learned a lot too. And yeah, I hope to see you around and maybe we'll chat again in the near future.
Yes, and just one parting thing based on your last comment.
Hmm.
Um, Read the books themselves and run your own group with your friends. That especially some of these indie games that are not very complex, that can be played in an afternoon. Run Fiasco with your friends, see how that goes. Maybe you might actually develop a gaming group together. So that is also a very valid way of doing this. Thank you so much for this conversation. What a lovely way to spend a morning.
Very kind, very kind.